the rolling hills of central Illinois, where prairie grass once whispered secrets to the wind, stands a monument to forgotten evil that the Catholic Church has spent over a century trying to erase from history. Between 1847 and 1862, 17 young priests and seminarians vanished without a trace from Sacred Heart Seminary, the Midwest's most prestigious Catholic institution. Church records list them as transferred to distant missions or called to extended spiritual retreats. But newly discovered correspondence hidden beneath the seminary's chapel floorboards tells a different story. One of systematic abduction, human trafficking, and murder that reached the highest levels of ecclesiastical authority. What makes this case particularly chilling is that investigators now believe the 3 men who ran Sacred Heart Seminary for 15 years weren't priests at all, but Irish criminals who had murdered the original clergy and assumed their identities. The Vatican has sealed these records for 150 years, but tonight, we're going to tell you what really happened in those hallowed halls where young men entered seeking God's calling and instead found themselves sold into slavery, or worse. Before we continue with the story of Sacred Heart Seminary and the men who disappeared within its walls, this channel isn't for everyone, only for those brave enough to uncover the darkest secrets that institutions try to bury. If you're ready to hear truths that will make you question everything you thought you knew about religious authority, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. Tell us in the comments what state or city you're listening from, because this story could have happened anywhere in America during those lawless times. Now, let's step back into 1847 and discover how a house of God became a marketplace for human souls. But to understand the full horror of what transpired at Sacred Heart, we must first understand the world that created it and the desperate times that made such evil possible. The year 1847 marked a turning point in American Catholic history that would create the perfect conditions for the horrors at Sacred Heart Seminary. Irish immigrants, fleeing the devastating potato famine that had killed over 1 million people in their homeland, poured into American cities by the hundreds of thousands, bringing with them a fierce devotion to their faith and an equally fierce suspicion from Protestant neighbors who viewed Catholicism as foreign, dangerous, and fundamentally un-American. Anti-Catholic sentiment ran so high that entire cities would erupt in riots at the mere suggestion of Catholic influence. In Philadelphia, nativist mobs had burned down Catholic churches and schools, leaving 13 dead and 50 wounded. In Charlestown, Massachusetts, Protestant crowds had destroyed the Ursuline convent, forcing nuns to flee for their lives through back windows while their sacred buildings burned behind them. Catholic priests were regularly tarred and feathered in broad daylight, and Catholic families lived in constant fear that their neighbors might turn violent at any moment. In this hostile environment, the Catholic Church desperately needed American-born priests who could speak without an accent, understand local customs, and serve as bridges between the immigrant masses and their new homeland. The church hierarchy recognized that foreign-born clergy, no matter how devout or educated, would always be viewed with suspicion by Protestant Americans who controlled local government, law enforcement, and business establishments. Sacred Heart Seminary, established in 1845 on 400 acres of pristine Illinois prairie, 40 miles southwest of Chicago, was designed to be that bridge, a place where young American men could train for the priesthood under the guidance of educated European clergy. creating a new generation of priests who could navigate both worlds successfully. The seminary itself was an architectural marvel for its time, designed by Irish architect Patrick Keeley, who had already gained fame for his Gothic revival churches throughout New England. The main building was a massive 3-story brick structure that rose from the prairie like a cathedral, with soaring windows that reached nearly 20 feet in height, hand-carved wooden pews imported from Bavaria, and a bell tower that could be heard for miles across the flat landscape on clear days. The building cost the astronomical sum of $40,000 to construct, more than most towns in Illinois were worth at the time, funded entirely by donations from wealthy Catholic families in Chicago, Milwaukee, and St. Louis, who saw the seminary as crucial to their faith's survival in America. The donors included Patrick Murphy, who had made his fortune in Great Lakes shipping, Francis O'Brien, who owned the largest brewery in Milwaukee, and Margaret Connolly, widow of a Chicago real estate magnate who contributed $8,000 alone, more money than most families would see in a lifetime. The seminary's library contained over 3,000 volumes, including rare theological texts, classical, literature, and scientific works that represented one of the finest collections of learning west of the Mississippi River. The building featured modern amenities unusual for rural areas: indoor plumbing with water pumped from a deep well, gas, lighting throughout the main floors, and a sophisticated heating system that used a central furnace and ductwork to warm the entire structure during Illinois' brutal winters. Father Superior Edmund Walsh arrived from County Cork in late 1846 to establish the seminary's academic program. A man of imposing stature who stood nearly 6 feet 4 inches tall, with penetrating gray eyes and a silver beard that reached nearly to his chest, Walsh commanded attention wherever he went. He spoke with the cultured accent of Trinity College Dublin and carried letters of recommendation from bishops across Ireland, including a particularly impressive testimonial from the Archbishop of Dublin himself. Walsh claimed to have studied theology at the prestigious Maynooth Seminary, where he had allegedly earned highest honors in moral theology and canon law. His supposed academic credentials included advanced degrees in philosophy, classical languages, and church history, making him one of the most educated priests in the American Midwest. He spoke fluent Latin, Greek, French, and German, could recite lengthy passages from St. Augustine and Thomas Aquinas from memory, and demonstrated an encyclopedic knowledge of church doctrine that impressed even the most learned bishops who interviewed him. Joining Walsh were Rector Thomas Murphy and Dean Patrick O'Brien, both equally impressive in their supposed qualifications and scholarly achievements. Murphy, a scholarly man in his early 40s with prematurely gray hair and wire-rimmed spectacles, allegedly held advanced degrees in philosophy and canon law from the University of Louvain in Belgium, one of Europe's most prestigious Catholic institutions. He claimed to have served as secretary to the Bishop of Cork, and to have published several theological treatises that had been well received by church scholars throughout Ireland and England. Dean Patrick O'Brien was younger than the others, perhaps 35, but equally compelling, with his supposed background in classical languages and church history from the Royal University of Ireland. O'Brien was particularly skilled in rhetoric and homiletics, delivering sermons that moved listeners to tears and demonstrating an ability to explain complex theological concepts in language that ordinary people could understand. His claim to have served as chaplain to wealthy Irish families, gave him knowledge of aristocratic customs and refined manners that impressed American Catholic society. Together, the three men presented an image of intellectual authority, spiritual devotion, and cultural sophistication that impressed even the most skeptical church officials. Bishop William Quarter of Chicago, who had ultimate authority over Sacred Heart Seminary, was so convinced of their qualifications that he granted them unprecedented autonomy in establishing the institution's policies and procedures. The seminary's first class in the fall of 1847 consisted of 12 young men, ages 18 to 25, drawn from Catholic families across the Midwest who had sacrificed significantly to afford the education. They came from diverse backgrounds. Heinrich Müller and Johann Weber, sons of German immigrants in Milwaukee whose families had pooled resources to send them. Patrick Kelly and Sean O'Malley from prosperous Irish families in Chicago who saw the priesthood as a path to social respectability. Antoine Dubois from a French family in Detroit that had grown wealthy in the fur trade. And even Thomas Morrison and David Anderson, converts from Protestant families who had embraced Catholicism despite fierce opposition from their relatives. These young men arrived with hearts full of religious devotion and minds eager to serve God, completely unaware that they were walking into a carefully constructed trap that had been months in the planning. Each student had been carefully selected based on specific criteria that the three false priests had established. Family wealth sufficient to pay the substantial tuition fees, physical strength suitable for heavy labor, educational background that would make them valuable in skilled positions, and social isolation that would make their disappearance easier to explain and harder to investigate. The daily routine at Sacred Heart appeared to follow traditional seminary practices established by centuries of Catholic education. Students rose at 4:30 a.m. for lauds, the first prayer service of the day, attended Mass at 5 a.m. in the seminary's magnificent chapel, and spent their days in a carefully structured routine of prayer, study, and manual labor, maintaining the seminary's extensive grounds. Their academic curriculum was rigorous and comprehensive, including Latin grammar and composition, Greek language and literature, philosophy covering ancient and medieval thought, systematic theology, examining church doctrine, church history from the apostolic age to the present, moral theology addressing ethical questions, canon law governing church administration, homiletics, teaching sermon preparation and delivery, and biblical studies focusing on both Old and New Testaments. The three priests maintained strict discipline and insisted on absolute obedience to authority, a requirement they justified as essential preparation for the hierarchical nature of church leadership. Students were forbidden from leaving the seminary grounds without written permission, from corresponding with family members more than once per month, and from discussing seminary affairs with outsiders during their rare visits to the nearby town of Millfield. This isolation was presented as spiritual necessity, but it served the darker purpose of preventing students from developing outside relationships that might interfere with the trafficking operation. The priests carefully monitored all incoming and outgoing mail, ostensibly to ensure that students maintained proper spiritual focus, but actually to control information flow and prevent any communication that might expose their criminal activities. The first disappearance occurred on a bitter February morning in 1848, just 5 months after the seminary opened, during one of the worst blizzards in Illinois history. For 3 days, snow had fallen continuously, piling into drifts that reached the second-story windows of the seminary building and making travel impossible on the surrounding roads. It was precisely the kind of weather that the false priests had been waiting for, conditions that would provide perfect cover for their operation while making immediate investigation impossible. Michael Brennan, a 22-year-old from a prosperous Irish family in Chicago, had shown particular promise in his theological studies and had been selected by Father Walsh to assist with special administrative duties that required access to the seminary's financial records and correspondence files. His family owned 3 successful grocery stores serving Chicago's growing Irish community and had paid the substantial sum of $200 per year for his education, money they had saved for over 5 years, believing they were investing in their son's future as a priest and their own family's standing in the community. Michael had written to his family just days before his disappearance, describing his joy at being selected for advanced responsibilities and his excitement about beginning specialized studies in moral theology. His letter, which would later be found among Walsh's papers, spoke of his deep gratitude for his parents' sacrifice and his determination to serve God and the Irish community with distinction. The letter bore no hint of distress, doubt, or any desire to leave the seminary. On the evening of February 13, 1848, Michael was summoned to Father Walsh's private office after the evening meal. Several students remembered seeing him walk down the corridor toward Walsh's office around 8:30 p.m., carrying a small leather portfolio containing his academic work. The office was located in a remote section of the seminary's administrative wing, separated from the student dormitories by thick stone walls that muffled sound transmission. According to later testimony from students who were questioned about that evening, raised voices could be heard coming from Walsh's office sometime around 9 p.m., though the specific words were indistinguishable. The argument, for that's what it clearly was, continued for nearly an hour, with periods of silence punctuated by shouting that seemed to involve multiple voices. Around 10:15 p.m. the sounds ceased abruptly, and an unsettling quiet settled over the administrative wing. Joseph Kennedy, Michael's roommate and closest friend at the seminary, waited until nearly midnight for Michael to return to their shared dormitory room. When Michael failed to appear by morning prayers at 4:30 a.m., Joseph assumed his friend had been given permission to sleep late due to his administrative duties. It wasn't until Father Walsh announced to the assembled students after morning mass that Joseph learned the official explanation for Michael's absence. Standing at the ornate wooden pulpit that dominated the seminary chapel, Walsh delivered the news with apparent sorrow and concern. Michael, he explained, had received an urgent call during the night to minister to cholera victims in a remote settlement near the Iowa border. The disease had struck a small Catholic community, and their local priest had died, leaving the faithful without spiritual guidance during their hour of greatest need. Michael, despite his youth and incomplete training, had volunteered for this dangerous mission, demonstrating the kind of selfless courage that marked true priestly calling. Walsh's explanation seemed reasonable on the surface, especially given the genuine cholera outbreaks that periodically devastated frontier communities during the 1840s. Cholera was a terrifying disease that could kill healthy adults within hours, and priests who ministered to victims faced almost certain death themselves. The image of young Michael sacrificing his safety to serve God and the faithful was exactly the kind of heroic narrative that inspired other seminarians and reinforced their own sense of calling. However, Joseph Kennedy noticed troubling details that didn't align with the official story. Most obviously, Michael's heavy winter coat remained hanging in their shared wardrobe, along with his warmest boots and thick woolen gloves, items that would be absolutely essential for travel during an Illinois February, especially to reach a remote settlement in Iowa. The temperature had dropped to 15 degrees below zero the previous night, making survival impossible for anyone traveling without proper winter clothing. Even more disturbing, Michael had mentioned nothing to Joseph about any possible call to ministry, despite the two young men sharing their deepest spiritual thoughts and concerns every evening before sleep. They had discussed their future plans just the night before Michael's disappearance, and Michael had spoken enthusiastically about his administrative work and his hopes of specializing in moral theology. He had shown no signs of restlessness, dissatisfaction, or desire for immediate ministry experience. Joseph also noticed that Michael's personal belongings remained exactly as he had left them, including his most treasured possession, a silver rosary that had belonged to his grandmother who had died during the Irish potato famine. Michael had never been seen without this rosary since arriving at the seminary, and Joseph found it inconceivable that his friend would depart for dangerous missionary work without taking this sacred family heirloom. When Joseph privately questioned Father Walsh about these inconsistencies the following day, the priest's reaction was swift, severe, and completely disproportionate to the nature of the inquiry. Walsh accused Joseph of harboring prideful curiosity that was incompatible with proper religious obedience and dangerous skepticism toward legitimate church authority. Such attitudes, Walsh warned, could lead to spiritual corruption and ultimate damnation if not corrected through severe penance and spiritual discipline. As punishment for his presumptuous questioning, Joseph was assigned to spend the next week in solitary prayer and fasting in the seminary's basement chapel, a damp, windowless room beneath the main structure, where students were sent to contemplate their spiritual failings and seek God's forgiveness. The basement chapel was carved directly into the hillside beneath the seminary, accessible only through a narrow stone staircase that descended from the main building's rear entrance. The basement chapel was a deliberately uncomfortable space, designed to encourage genuine repentance through physical hardship. The walls were rough-hewn stone that wept moisture continuously, creating an atmosphere of perpetual dampness that chilled to the bone. The only light came from candles that students were required to maintain themselves, and the only warmth came from a small brazier that provided minimal heat during the worst winter weather. During his week of isolation in this underground chamber, Joseph experienced something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Late at night, usually around 2 a.m. when the seminary was supposed to be completely silent, he could hear the unmistakable sounds of horses' hooves and wagon wheels on the frozen ground outside the basement chapel. The sounds were clear and distinct despite the thick stone walls, suggesting that the activity was taking place directly above his underground prison. The nocturnal activity followed a consistent pattern that became more disturbing with each occurrence. First came the sound of horses approaching from the direction of the main road, moving slowly and carefully as if the drivers were familiar with the terrain but wanted to avoid making unnecessary noise. Next came voices speaking in hushed tones, always the same 3 voices that Joseph recognized as belonging to Walsh, Murphy, and O'Brien, though he could never make out their specific words through the stone ceiling. The conversations typically lasted about 15 minutes, followed by the sounds of heavy objects being moved, dragging noises, grunting sounds suggesting physical exertion, and the creaking of wagon springs adjusting to shifting weight. During these periods, Joseph could see lantern light flickering through the basement chapel's single dirt-encrusted window, casting moving shadows on the stone walls that suggested multiple figures working in coordination. The entire process typically took about an hour, always ending with the sound of wagon wheels departing in the direction opposite from their arrival, toward the road leading to Springfield rather than Chicago. After the wagons departed, complete silence would return to the seminary, and the next morning would proceed exactly as if nothing unusual had occurred. On the third night of his confinement, Joseph positioned himself directly beneath the basement chapel's window and managed to catch a clearer glimpse of the activity above. Through the dirty glass, he could see the silhouettes of 3 men loading what appeared to be a large, heavy bundle into the back of a covered wagon. The bundle was wrapped in dark cloth and required all 3 men to lift, suggesting considerable weight. Most chilling was the care with which they handled their burden, not the rough treatment appropriate for cargo or supplies, but the cautious movements used when transporting something precious or fragile. The second disappearance came just 6 weeks after Michael Brennan's vanishing, and this time the pattern became impossible for observant students to ignore. Thomas Gallagher, the 20-year-old son of a German immigrant family from Milwaukee, was universally regarded by his fellow students as the gentlest, most devout member of their class. He spent extra hours in private prayer, helped struggling classmates with their Latin translations, and had never been known to raise his voice or express anger about anything. Thomas came from a family that embodied the American dream through hard work and sacrifice. His father, Klaus Gallagher, originally Klaus Müller before anglicizing his name upon arrival in America, had started as a day laborer in Milwaukee's growing brewery industry and had worked his way up to become foreman of one of the city's largest operations. His mother, Anna, took in sewing and laundry to supplement the family income, working 16-hour days to help save money for Thomas's seminary education. The Gallaghers had sacrificed enormously to afford Sacred Heart's tuition, selling their small farm outside Milwaukee and moving into a cramped tenement apartment so they could dedicate every possible dollar to their son's religious calling. Thomas carried the weight of his family's sacrifice heavily, frequently expressing to fellow students his determination to justify their faith in him and to serve God with the dedication their generosity deserved. On the evening of March 30th, 1848, Thomas was summoned to Father Walsh's private office immediately after evening prayers. The summons came through Dean Patrick O'Brien, who approached Thomas in the seminary chapel with an unusually grave expression and whispered instructions that he was needed for urgent consultation regarding his academic progress. Thomas appeared, confused by the summons, telling his closest friend, Heinrich Weber, that he was unaware of any problems with his studies and couldn't imagine what urgent matter required immediate attention. Several students positioned in dormitory rooms near the administrative wing reported hearing raised voices, coming from Walsh's office beginning around 9 p.m. and continuing intermittently until nearly 11 p.m. The conversation appeared to involve multiple participants, with periods of calm discussion interrupted by what sounded like arguments or heated disagreements. Students later testified that they heard Thomas's voice at several points, sounding distressed and increasingly agitated as the evening progressed. Around 10:30 p.m., long after the seminary's mandatory evening silence was supposed to begin, Heinrich, Weber and 2 other students reported hearing what sounded like furniture being moved or overturned in Walsh's office, followed by a period of complete silence that lasted nearly 30 minutes. Then, Around 11 p.m., they heard the familiar sound of a horse-drawn wagon departing from behind the seminary building, traveling slowly with muffled wheels as if the drivers were attempting to minimize noise. The next morning, Father Walsh announced during Mass that Thomas had experienced what he termed a profound spiritual crisis during their evening consultation. Thomas had confessed to struggling with impure thoughts incompatible with priestly vocation, and had reached the painful conclusion that he was not suited for religious life. Rather than face the shame of public failure, Thomas had voluntarily left the seminary before dawn to join a contemplative monastery in the Wisconsin wilderness, where years of silence and isolation would help him overcome his spiritual struggles, and perhaps eventually qualify him for a different form of religious service. Walsh's explanation was crafted with psychological sophistication, playing upon common fears and anxieties that many seminary students experienced. Sexual temptation was a genuine struggle for young men committed to celibacy, and the shame associated with such feelings often led to extreme measures of self-punishment and isolation. The idea of a troubled student seeking redemption through monastic retreat was entirely plausible and consistent with traditional Catholic approaches to spiritual crisis. However, as with Michael Brennan's disappearance, troubling details emerged for those who looked closely at the official explanation. Thomas had left behind his most precious possession, a rosary hand-carved by his dying mother, which he had never been seen without since arriving at the seminary 8 months earlier. The rosary was found carefully placed on his dormitory desk, suggesting deliberate placement rather than forgotten abandonment. Even more suspicious, Thomas had departed so suddenly that he hadn't collected the $50 in personal funds that his family had provided for incidental expenses, money that remained locked in Father Walsh's office safe. For a family that had sacrificed so much to afford seminary tuition, abandoning $50 represented a financial loss that would have significant impact on their daily survival. Most disturbing of all was a letter Thomas had been writing to his younger sister Maria, which remained unfinished on his desk. The letter stopped mid-sentence in a description of his joy at serving God and his excitement about beginning advanced theological studies in the coming term. The final line read, "I wake each morning grateful to God for guiding me to this holy place, where I grow closer to Him each day, and I cannot imagine any life more blessed than the one He has." The sentence ended abruptly, as if Thomas had been interrupted while writing. Heinrich Weber, Thomas's closest friend at the seminary, found the incomplete letter particularly disturbing because Thomas had shared the contents with him the evening before his disappearance. Thomas had been enthusiastic about describing to Maria his progress in theological studies and his growing confidence in his calling to priesthood. He had planned to finish the letter the following day and had specifically mentioned wanting to tell Maria about a particularly inspiring lecture Father Walsh had delivered on moral theology. Word of the disappearances began to spread among the remaining students, though always in whispers and never in the presence of the 3 priests. The student body of originally 12 had now lost 2 members in just 6 weeks, and the official explanations, while individually plausible, began to seem suspicious when considered together. Some students defended the priests' accounts, arguing that God's call could come suddenly, and that true devotion sometimes required abandoning worldly attachments, including family relationships and material possessions. Others, however, began to notice patterns that filled them with growing unease. Both Michael and Thomas had been among the most financially well-off students, Both had demonstrated exceptional academic promise that made them valuable additions to any religious community, and both had been called to private meetings with Father Walsh shortly before their departures. Additionally, both had left behind personal possessions that seemed inconsistent with voluntary departure, and both had shown no previous signs of doubt, distress, or desire to leave the seminary. The atmosphere at Sacred Heart began to change, in subtle but unmistakable ways. Students became more guarded in their conversations, more careful about expressing opinions or asking questions that might be interpreted as challenging authority. The easy camaraderie that had characterized the seminary's early months gave way to an undercurrent of anxiety and suspicion that affected every aspect of daily life. As the harsh Illinois winter gradually gave way to spring, the disappearances at Sacred Heart Seminary continued with terrifying regularity that revealed the systematic nature of the operation. By Christmas of 1848, 5 more young men had vanished from the institution, each departure accompanied by increasingly elaborate explanations from the 3 false priests that demonstrated their growing confidence in their ability to manipulate both students and outside authorities. The third disappearance involved Antoine Dubois, the French seminarian from Detroit, whose family had made their fortune in the fur trade. Antoine possessed valuable skills in wilderness survival, animal tracking, and Native American languages that made him particularly attractive to buyers seeking workers for frontier operations. He vanished during a supposed emergency call to minister to a remote French settlement that was allegedly under threat from hostile Native American tribes. The fourth was Heinrich Weber, Thomas Gallagher's closest friend, who had begun asking too many questions about his roommate's sudden departure. Heinrich was reportedly transferred to a specialized seminary in Baltimore that focused on preparing priests for German immigrant communities. A transfer that required such secrecy that he was forbidden from saying goodbye to his fellow students or writing to inform his family until he was safely established in his new location. By the end of 1848, the student body had shrunk from 12 to 7, and those who remained lived in a state of constant anxiety, never knowing who might be next to receive that dreaded summons to Father Walsh's office. The survivors developed an unspoken system of mutual protection, noting who was called away for private meetings and making mental inventories of their fellow students' most valued possessions as a way of monitoring whose departure might be imminent. Joseph Kennedy, who had witnessed the first disappearance of his roommate Michael and had endured a week of solitary confinement for questioning the official explanation, found himself unable to concentrate on his theological studies. The memory of those late-night sounds from the basement chapel haunted him, and he began paying careful attention to patterns and details that he had previously dismissed as unimportant. Joseph noticed that disappearances always occurred during specific weather conditions. Cold, overcast nights when travel would be difficult, but concealment would be easier. They typically happened during the week rather than on weekends, when visiting family members or church officials might be present on the seminary grounds. Most significantly, they always followed private meetings with Father Walsh that lasted significantly longer than normal academic consultations. The surviving students also began to observe changes in the 3 priests that seemed inconsistent with their claimed backgrounds and spiritual calling. Father Walsh, who had arrived at Sacred Heart with modest belongings and simple clerical garments, now wore silk vestments during Mass that had obviously cost more than most priests earned in a year. He had acquired an expensive gold pocket watch manufactured in Switzerland, which he consulted frequently during his lectures, and had purchased new furniture for his private office that included a mahogany desk imported from Ireland. Rector Murphy had somehow obtained funds to purchase new leather-bound books for the seminary library, volumes that cost more than most families earned in a month, and included rare theological works that would normally be found only in major European universities. He had also begun wearing spectacles with gold frames and had acquired a seal ring that he claimed bore his family coat of arms, though none of the Irish students recognized the symbols as belonging to any legitimate Irish family. Dean O'Brien had perhaps shown the most dramatic change in circumstances, acquiring a magnificent black stallion that he claimed was a gift from grateful parishioners in his former parish in Ireland. The horse was clearly a thoroughbred worth several $100s, and O'Brien demonstrated riding skills that seemed more appropriate to a wealthy landowner than a humble parish priest. He had also begun taking regular trips to Chicago, ostensibly for church business, but always returning with new possessions and an air of satisfaction that suggested successful commercial transactions rather than spiritual consultations. The three men also began taking frequent trips away from the seminary, sometimes for several days at a time, claiming to visit church officials in Chicago, Milwaukee, or St. Louis. During these absences, the remaining students were supervised by Francis McManus, the elderly lay brother who had arrived at Sacred Heart at the same time as the three priests and seemed to serve as their assistant and confidant. McManus was a peculiar figure who generated considerable unease among the students. He spoke very little, moved with a furtive, nervous manner, and seemed perpetually frightened of something he never identified. When students attempted to engage him in conversation about his background or his work at the seminary, he would become visibly agitated and refuse to answer direct questions. Most disturbing was his reaction whenever anyone mentioned the missing students. He would immediately change the subject or find urgent work that required him to leave the area. Several students noticed that McManus possessed detailed knowledge of the seminary's grounds that suggested extensive familiarity with areas that were supposedly off-limits to everyone except the priests. He knew the locations of storage areas, root cellars, and outbuildings that were never mentioned in official tours of the facility. He also demonstrated knowledge of the surrounding countryside that seemed inconsistent with his claimed role as a religious assistant who rarely left the seminary grounds. Perhaps most disturbing was the seminary's correspondence with the outside world, which revealed a level of control and deception that suggested careful planning and systematic implementation. Family members who wrote to inquire about their sons received responses on official Sacred Heart letterhead, but the handwriting was always that of Father Walsh, never the students themselves. The letters followed consistent patterns that seemed designed to discourage further inquiry while providing plausible explanations for reduced communication. When parents requested specific information about their son's well-being, academic progress, or daily activities, they were told that advanced theological studies required periods of spiritual silence, during which students were forbidden from worldly communication that might distract from their religious development. Families who asked for direct letters from their sons were informed that such correspondence would be permitted only after successful completion of specific spiritual milestones that might take months or years to achieve. The local community in The nearby town of Millfield, population barely 300, began to whisper about strange occurrences near the seminary that seemed inconsistent with the quiet, contemplative atmosphere appropriate to a religious institution. Farmers reported seeing covered wagons traveling at odd hours along the rarely used road that connected Sacred Heart to the main highway toward Chicago, always moving slowly and carefully as if attempting to avoid detection. Samuel Morrison, who owned the farm adjacent to the seminary property, claimed to have found personal items scattered along the fence line that separated his land from the seminary grounds. The items included a prayer book with Michael Brennan written inside the front cover, a pair of wire-rimmed spectacles that had belonged to Heinrich Weber, and a silver crucifix that several people recognized as having been worn by Thomas Gallagher. When Morrison attempted to return these items to the seminary, Father Walsh claimed they had been deliberately discarded by students who were learning to abandon worldly attachments as part of their spiritual development. The winter of 1849-1850 brought a series of events that would fundamentally transform the nature of the mystery surrounding Sacred Heart Seminary and reveal the true scope of the horror that had been unfolding behind the facade of religious education. The seminary's isolation during Illinois' brutal winter months created perfect conditions for the criminals to accelerate their operations while making detection or escape virtually impossible for their victims. James O'Malley, a seminary student from Detroit whose father was a prosperous merchant with extensive connections throughout the Great Lakes region, had grown increasingly suspicious of the priest's explanations for his missing classmates. Unlike the other students, who came primarily from working-class immigrant families with limited resources and political influence, James had connections to influential Catholics in multiple cities, including his uncle, Father Patrick O'Malley, who served as secretary to the Bishop of Detroit and corresponded regularly with church officials throughout the Midwest. James possessed advantages that made him particularly dangerous to the trafficking operation. His family's wealth meant that his disappearance would be noticed and investigated by people with the resources to pursue inquiries across state lines. His uncle's position in the church hierarchy provided access to communication networks that could bypass local control and reach authorities in Rome if necessary. Most importantly, James had received a classical education that included training in logic, rhetoric, and investigation techniques that made him capable of systematic analysis and evidence gathering. Beginning in the fall of 1849, James started conducting his own investigation into the disappearances, carefully documenting discrepancies in the priest's stories and maintaining detailed records of which students had disappeared and under what circumstances. He created a detailed timeline that revealed patterns invisible to casual observation, including the fact that all disappearances had occurred during specific weather conditions and that the official explanations contained internal contradictions. That became obvious when examined systematically. James noticed that the three priests seemed to possess detailed knowledge of each student's family financial situation, information that would normally be kept confidential in church records and would only be available to someone who had conducted thorough investigations into each family's background. The priests knew which students came from wealthy families, which had agricultural land that could be used as collateral, and which had relatives in other cities who might provide assistance in times of crisis. Most significantly, James discovered that the seminary's financial records contained discrepancies that suggested income far exceeding what would be expected from tuition payments alone. By carefully observing the priests' spending patterns and comparing them to the seminary's official budget, James calculated that Sacred Heart was generating several $1,000s in unexplained revenue each year, money that had to be coming from sources other than student fees or church donations. The breakthrough in James's investigation came in December 1849, when he discovered a cache of letters hidden beneath loose floorboards in the seminary's library, concealed in a space that appeared to have been deliberately constructed to hide documents from casual inspection. The hiding place was sophisticated, involving a section of flooring that could be removed only by manipulating specific boards in a precise sequence, suggesting that it had been designed by someone with detailed knowledge of carpentry and security techniques. The letters, written in various hands and bearing postmarks from cities across the Midwest, appeared to be communications between Father Walsh and unknown correspondents who were clearly involved in commercial transactions of some kind. The correspondence was written in a peculiar code that mixed legitimate business terminology with religious language in ways that seemed designed to disguise the true nature of the discussions. James spent weeks analyzing the coded language, using his classical education and knowledge of multiple languages to decipher meanings that became increasingly horrifying as he understood more of the system. The letters discussed merchandise of varying quality and negotiated delivery schedules to locations in Indiana, Wisconsin, Iowa, and Illinois. References to prime specimens, educational background, and physical condition made it clear that the merchandise was human beings who were being evaluated and sold based on their characteristics and capabilities. One letter, dated November 15, 1849, contained references that made James's blood run cold and confirmed his worst suspicions about what had happened to his missing classmates. The letter read, in part, "The latest shipment included 2 prime specimens, both young and strong, suitable for heavy labor. The German boy brought premium price due to his education and physical condition. Buyers in the coal regions are particularly interested in educated workers who can serve as overseers for immigrant crews. The Irish lad was sold separately to lumber interests in Wisconsin, where his literacy skills make him valuable for record keeping. Both transactions completed without complications." James realized he was looking at evidence of human trafficking on a massive scale, with his missing classmates being systematically sold as slaves to mining operations, lumber companies, and industrial concerns across the Midwest. The letters indicated that educated young men, particularly those from Catholic families, commanded high prices because their religious training made them trustworthy overseers, while their social isolation made their disappearances easier to explain and harder to investigate. The correspondence revealed that the operation was far more sophisticated than a simple kidnapping scheme. The criminals had established networks of buyers throughout multiple states, had developed systems for transporting victims without detection, and had created elaborate cover stories that could withstand casual investigation by family members or church officials. Further analysis of the letters revealed pricing structures that treated human beings as commodities to be evaluated and sold based on market demand. Young men with theological education commanded prices between $300 and $500, depending on their physical condition, language skills, and family background. Those with specialized knowledge, carpentry, bookkeeping, or foreign languages brought premium prices of up to $800. Most chilling was a reference to damaged goods that had to be permanently disposed of when they proved unsuitable for resale. Armed with this evidence, James attempted to contact church authorities outside Sacred Heart to report his discoveries. However, he quickly discovered that his correspondence was being intercepted and read before being sent. When he tried to send a coded message to his uncle in Detroit using Latin phrases that would be meaningless to casual readers but would alert Father Patrick to serious problems, the letter was returned to him with a note from Father Walsh claiming that ecclesiastical correspondence required official review to ensure proper theological content. James realized that he was trapped in an increasingly dangerous situation. The three criminals now knew that he suspected something, and they had demonstrated their willingness to murder anyone who threatened their operation. His only hope lay in gathering enough evidence to expose the entire network before they decided to eliminate him, as they had eliminated others who had grown too suspicious. The confrontation that James had been dreading came on a frigid January evening in 1850, when Father Walsh summoned him to his private office after evening prayers. James entered the meeting knowing that his life was in immediate danger, but hoping that his family connections and social position might provide some protection against the immediate violence that had claimed his classmates. The office had been transformed since James's last visit several months earlier. Expensive carpets covered the stone floor, oil paintings in elaborate gold frames decorated the walls, and the massive mahogany desk was covered with papers and ledgers that suggested extensive business activities. Most ominous was the presence of Dean O'Brien and Rector Murphy, who stood flanking Walsh's desk like bodyguards rather than fellow priests. Walsh's demeanor during the confrontation was completely different from the pastoral, scholarly persona he maintained in public. Speaking in the harsh accent of Dublin's criminal districts, he dropped all pretense of religious authority and addressed James with the calculating coldness of a businessman protecting a profitable enterprise. "You've been asking questions that could be dangerous for your health," Walsh said, leaning back in his expensive leather chair. "Young men who don't understand their place have been known to suffer unfortunate accidents in these isolated areas." The threat was explicit and unambiguous, but James detected something in Walsh's manner that suggested the criminals were not entirely confident in their ability to eliminate him without consequences. His family's wealth and connections meant that his disappearance would trigger investigations that might prove difficult to deflect with the same techniques that had worked with previous victims. Walsh offered James a choice that revealed both the scope of the operation and the desperation of the criminals to maintain their cover. James could join the trafficking network as a willing participant, using his family connections to identify wealthy Catholic families whose sons might be suitable targets. In exchange, he would receive a share of the profits and would be protected from the fate that had befallen his classmates. Alternatively, he could maintain silence about what he had discovered and would be allowed to complete his seminary education, though he would be closely monitored to ensure his continued cooperation. The offer revealed that the criminals understood they had created a situation that was becoming increasingly difficult to maintain. The accumulation of disappearances was generating attention from families and church officials that required more sophisticated management than simple elimination of witnesses. They needed allies within the Catholic community who could help deflect suspicion and provide early warning of official investigations. James realized that accepting either option would make him complicit in the continued victimization of innocent young men. More importantly, he understood that agreeing to cooperation would not guarantee his safety. The criminals would eliminate him as soon as he was no longer useful, or if he showed any signs of betraying their confidence. The weeks following James' O'Malley's confrontation with the three false priests marked the most dangerous period in Sacred Heart Seminary's dark history. James had refused both options offered by Walsh, claiming that he needed time to consider such a momentous decision. But both sides understood that the situation could not remain unresolved indefinitely. The criminals were growing increasingly nervous about the attention their operation was attracting, while James was desperately searching for a way to expose the truth without becoming their next victim. During this tense period, James discovered that he was under constant surveillance by Francis McManus, the nervous lay brother who seemed to appear wherever James went throughout the seminary grounds. McManus would position himself where he could observe James's activities while pretending to perform maintenance tasks. And James noticed that the man was taking notes in a small leather journal that he kept hidden in his robes. The surveillance extended beyond simple observation. James found that his personal belongings were being searched regularly, books moved from their usual positions, papers disturbed in his desk drawer, and clothing rearranged in ways that suggested systematic examination. Most alarming was the discovery that someone had been entering his dormitory room during the night, as evidenced by footprints in the dust near his bed and the faint smell of tobacco smoke that lingered in the air each morning. Just when it seemed the tension at Sacred Heart Seminary could grow no darker, James made a discovery that would reveal the true scope of the horror that had been unfolding for years. If you're feeling your heart race as this tale of institutional evil unfolds, you're not alone. Thousands of brave souls in our community have experienced these same chills while learning truths that others are too frightened to reveal. Hamiti, that like button, if this investigation is keeping you on the edge of your seat. And don't forget to subscribe, because this channel is only for those who dare to uncover the darkest secrets in American history. Now let's discover what James found that would change everything. The breakthrough came when James observed a pattern in the seminary's routine that he had previously overlooked. Every 2 weeks, usually on Saturday nights, the three priests would announce that they needed to conduct private devotions that required absolute silence throughout the seminary. Students were confined to their dormitory rooms from sunset until sunrise, forbidden from leaving for any reason, and warned that anyone caught violating the restriction would face severe disciplinary action. James had initially assumed these restrictions were related to legitimate religious observances, but careful observation revealed that they coincided with increased activity around the seminary's outbuildings and storage areas. During one of these devotional periods, James positioned himself at his dormitory window and observed lantern lights moving between various buildings on the seminary grounds, accompanied by the sounds of wagons arriving and departing throughout the night. On the night of February 15, 1850, James made a decision that would either expose the full truth about Sacred Heart Seminary or cost him his life. During one of the mandatory confinement periods, he slipped out of his dormitory room and made his way to the seminary's basement, where he had noticed unusual activity during previous observations. The basement levels of Sacred Heart Seminary were far more extensive than James had realized, including areas that seemed to serve no legitimate educational or religious purpose. Beyond the basement chapel where Joseph Kennedy had been confined, James discovered a series of storage rooms, workshops, and chambers that had been excavated from the hillside beneath the main building. The construction was sophisticated and recent, suggesting that significant work had been done to expand the underground areas after the seminary's official completion. In one of these hidden chambers, James made a discovery that confirmed his worst fears and revealed that the horror at Sacred Heart was even more extensive than he had imagined. The room contained detailed records of the trafficking operation, including ledgers that documented every transaction, correspondence with buyers throughout the Midwest, and maps showing transportation routes used to move victims to their final destinations. The records revealed that Sacred Heart Seminary was just one component of a vast criminal network that operated across multiple states and involved dozens of accomplices in various cities. The operation had been active for over a decade, with Sacred Heart serving as a collection point where young men could be systematically isolated, evaluated, and prepared for sale to buyers who had specific requirements for workers in mining, lumber, agriculture, and industrial operations. The ledgers contained detailed descriptions of each victim, including physical characteristics, educational background, family wealth, and estimated sale price. James found entries for all of his missing classmates, along with dozens of other young men who had disappeared from various Catholic institutions throughout the Midwest. The scope of the operation was staggering. Over 200 victims in 10 years, generating profits that exceeded $100,000 and involved buyers in Illinois, Wisconsin, Iowa, Indiana, and Minnesota. Most horrifying was a section of the records titled Permanent Disposal, which contained the names and details of victims who had been murdered rather than sold. These were young men who had become suspicious, attempted to escape, or possessed information that made them too dangerous to release. The records indicated that 17 such victims had been killed at Sacred Heart Seminary alone, their bodies buried in carefully concealed graves scattered across the seminary's 400 acres. As James studied these documents by candlelight in the underground chamber, he heard footsteps approaching from the corridor outside. Someone was descending into the basement levels, moving slowly and carefully as if attempting to avoid detection. James quickly extinguished his candle and concealed himself behind a stack of wooden crates, hoping that whoever was approaching would pass by without entering the record room. The footsteps stopped directly outside the chamber where James was hiding. Through a crack between the crates, he could see Father Walsh holding a lantern and peering into the room with an expression of suspicious concern. Walsh entered the chamber and began examining the area where James had been reading the records, clearly searching for signs that someone had disturbed the carefully organized documents. For several terrifying minutes, Walsh conducted a methodical search of the room while James remained motionless behind the crates, barely daring to breathe. The false priest's lantern cast dancing shadows on the stone walls as he checked locks, examined papers, and looked for any evidence of unauthorized intrusion. At one point, Walsh passed within 3 feet of James's hiding place, close enough that James could smell the tobacco on his clothing and hear his muttered curses as he searched for signs of discovery. Finally, apparently satisfied that the records remained undisturbed, Walsh departed from the chamber and continued his patrol of the basement levels. James waited nearly an hour before emerging from his hiding place, using the time to memorize as much information as possible from the trafficking records. He understood that this might be his only opportunity to gather evidence, and he needed to obtain enough specific details to convince authorities of the operation's scope and legitimacy. The opportunity James O'Malley desperately needed came from an unexpected source that would prove to be the salvation not only for him, but for the entire investigation into Sacred Heart Seminary's dark secrets. In March 1850, Bishop Giovanni Montini arrived from Rome to conduct an apostolic visitation of Catholic institutions throughout the American Midwest, a comprehensive inspection that had been ordered by Pope Pius IX in response to concerning reports about irregular practices at several American seminaries and colleges. Bishop Montini was not a typical church bureaucrat, content with superficial inspections and ceremonial visits. A former professor of canon law at the Gregorian University in Rome, he had developed a reputation throughout Europe for uncovering corruption and misconduct within church institutions. His investigations had exposed financial fraud in French monasteries, sexual misconduct in German seminaries, and political corruption involving Italian bishops. The Vatican had sent him to America specifically because they needed someone with the experience and authority to conduct truly thorough investigations without being influenced by local political considerations or personal relationships. Montini's arrival in the Midwest had been announced only to the highest levels of church hierarchy, and even they had received only general information about his mission. This secrecy was deliberate, designed to prevent institutions from preparing elaborate deceptions or concealing evidence before his arrival. The bishop's methodology involved appearing without warning, conducting extensive interviews with students and faculty, examining financial records in detail, and following up on any irregularities he discovered. James learned of Bishop Montini's presence in the region through a conversation overheard between Father Walsh and Rector Murphy, who were clearly agitated about the possibility of an unexpected inspection. Their discussion revealed that they had received unofficial warnings from contacts in Chicago that a high-ranking Vatican official was conducting investigations throughout the Midwest, and that several institutions had already been subjected to intensive scrutiny. Understanding that this represented his only chance to expose the truth about Sacred Heart Seminary, James began planning how to contact Bishop Montini without alerting the three criminals to his intentions. The challenge was significant, since all of his correspondence was monitored and his movements were under constant surveillance by Francis McManus and the false priests themselves. James's solution demonstrated both courage and cleverness that would save not only his own life, but potentially dozens of future victims. He volunteered to assist with preparations for the bishop's potential visit to Sacred Heart, offering to help clean and organize areas of the seminary that visitors might inspect. This gave him legitimate reasons to move throughout the buildings and grounds while gathering additional evidence of the trafficking operation. More importantly, James used his access to the seminary's correspondence to discover that Bishop Montini was staying at the residence of Bishop William Quarter in Chicago while conducting his investigations. James crafted a letter that appeared to be a routine request for spiritual guidance, but which contained coded references that would alert an educated church official to serious problems requiring immediate investigation. The letter, written in Latin with specific theological terminology that demonstrated genuine seminary education, requested a private meeting to discuss urgent spiritual concerns regarding the proper interpretation of church authority and the moral obligations of seminary students when confronted with apparent violations of canon law. To a casual reader, the letter appeared to be a routine request from a devout student seeking guidance on theological questions. To someone with Bishop Montini's education and experience, however, the language clearly indicated that the writer had discovered serious misconduct that required investigation by church authorities. James managed to send the letter through a complicated process that involved bribing a local farmer to mail it from the town of Springfield, 40 miles away, using money he had saved from his personal allowance. The farmer, Samuel Morrison, was the same man who had found personal belongings scattered along the fence line between his property and the seminary grounds, and he had grown increasingly suspicious about activities at Sacred Heart. Bishop Montini's response came within a week, arriving through unofficial channels that demonstrated his understanding of the sensitive nature of James's communication. Rather than sending a formal reply through church mail systems, the bishop arranged for James to meet him at a small church in Millfield during what appeared to be a routine pastoral visit to rural communities in the area. The meeting took place on March 15, 1850, in the sacristy of St. Patrick's Church in Millfield, a small wooden building that served the area's scattered Catholic families. Bishop Montini was a small, intense man in his 50s, with penetrating dark eyes and an aura of intellectual authority that immediately convinced James that he was speaking to someone capable of understanding and addressing the horrors at Sacred Heart Seminary. Speaking in Latin to ensure privacy and to demonstrate his theological education, James presented his evidence to Bishop Montini in a carefully organized presentation that covered every aspect of the trafficking operation he had discovered. He showed the bishop copies of letters he had transcribed from the hidden cache, provided detailed timelines of the disappearances, and explained the financial discrepancies that indicated income far exceeding legitimate seminary operations. Most importantly, James provided Bishop Montini with specific information that could be verified independently, including the names and supposed locations of missing students, the locations of suspected burial sites on the seminary grounds, and details about the false identities assumed by Walsh, Murphy, and O'Brien. He also shared his observations about the priests' suspicious behavior, their unexplained wealth, and the surveillance and intimidation tactics they used to control students and prevent outside communication. Bishop Montini listened to James's account with growing horror and alarm, taking detailed notes and asking specific questions that demonstrated both his understanding of the gravity of the situation and his knowledge of proper investigative procedures. As someone who had studied in Ireland and knew the actual credentials required for priests serving in American missions, he immediately recognized inconsistencies in the backgrounds claimed by the three false priests. More significantly, Bishop Montini had access to Vatican records that could verify whether Walsh, Murphy, and O'Brien had ever been legitimately ordained as Catholic priests. His immediate response was to send encrypted telegraph messages to Rome requesting complete background checks on all three men, using the Vatican's extensive records of ordinations, assignments, and transfers throughout the Catholic world. The bishop's investigation moved with the efficiency and authority that only comes from the highest levels of church hierarchy. Within 48 hours, he had received responses from Rome confirming that no priests named Edmund Walsh, Thomas Murphy, or Patrick O'Brien had been assigned to American missions from the Irish dioceses claimed by the three men. Telegraph communications with church officials in Ireland revealed that while priests with those names had existed, they had departed Ireland in 1846, but had never arrived at their intended destination in America. Further investigation revealed even more disturbing information. The real Father Edmund Walsh, Rector Thomas Murphy, and Dean Patrick O'Brien had been traveling together aboard the merchant ship Bridget's Hope when it had been attacked by pirates off the coast of Newfoundland in August 1846. While the ship itself had eventually reached port in Boston. Several passengers, including the 3 priests, had been reported missing and presumed dead. Church officials had assumed that the priests had been killed during the pirate attack, and replacement clergy had been assigned to their intended positions in America. Armed with this evidence, Bishop Montini organized a coordinated investigation that would expose the full scope of the Sacred Heart Seminary operation and bring justice for the 17 young men who had disappeared. The investigation involved church officials from multiple dioceses, federal marshals with authority to pursue crimes across state lines, and local law enforcement officials who had been carefully selected for their integrity and competence. The operation to arrest the 3 criminals was planned with military precision to prevent their escape and to preserve evidence that might be destroyed if they received warning of the approaching investigation. On the morning of March 20th, 1850, a force of 12 armed men surrounded Sacred Heart Seminary before dawn, positioning themselves at all possible escape routes and communication points. The confrontation was swift but dramatic, revealing the true nature of the men who had masqueraded as priests for over 3 years. Walsh attempted to maintain his clerical identity even as federal marshals placed him in chains, claiming that the charges were the result of anti-Catholic persecution by Protestant authorities who wanted to destroy the seminary. He demanded to speak with church officials and insisted that any investigation be conducted through proper ecclesiastical channels rather than civil law enforcement. However, when Bishop Montini confronted Walsh with documented proof of his true identity and criminal background, the facade that had been maintained for years finally crumbled completely. The man who had commanded respect and obedience as Father Superior Edmund Walsh was revealed to be Seamus McKenna, a Dublin criminal with a history of violence, theft, and human trafficking stretching back over 15 years. McKenna's true background was even more horrifying than investigators had suspected. Born in the slums of Dublin, he had begun his criminal career as a member of violent gangs that preyed upon immigrants attempting to flee Ireland during the potato famine. His organization had developed sophisticated techniques for identifying vulnerable families, gaining their trust through religious connections, and then robbing, kidnapping, or murdering them for profit. The attack on the merchant ship Brigid's Hope had been planned specifically to obtain the credentials and identities of the 3 legitimate priests. McKenna's gang had learned of the priests' travel plans through contacts in Dublin's Catholic community, had intercepted their ship using a vessel disguised as a merchant trader, and had murdered the clergy after torturing them for information about their backgrounds and intended assignments in America. Thomas Murphy was revealed to be Liam Doherty, McKenna's lieutenant and the organization's specialist in financial fraud and document forgery. Doherty had spent months studying Catholic theology and church practices, memorizing enough information to maintain the pretense of being an educated priest while developing the financial systems needed to launder money from the trafficking operation. Patrick O'Brien was actually Fergus Lynch, the most violent member of the organization and the person responsible for the actual kidnapping and transportation of victims. Lynch had killed at least 12 people during his criminal career, including several of the Sacred Heart Seminary students who had become too suspicious or had attempted to escape. The complete investigation of Sacred Heart Seminary revealed the full scope of the horror that had been perpetrated under the guise of religious education, exposing a criminal network that exceeded even the worst fears of church officials and law enforcement authorities. The search teams that systematically examined the seminary's 400 acres located the remains of 7 murdered students buried in carefully concealed graves throughout the property, each burial site selected and prepared with meticulous attention to concealment and preservation. The bodies were found in various states of preservation, some having been buried for over 2 years, while others were more recent victims of the trafficking operation. Each victim had been killed by blunt force, trauma to the head, suggesting that they had been murdered quickly and efficiently when they became threats to the operation's security. The careful placement of the bodies and the sophistication of the burial sites indicated that the criminals had extensive experience in disposing of murder victims. The trafficking network uncovered at Sacred Heart proved to be far more extensive than even James O'Malley had suspected during his investigation. Documents found hidden throughout the seminary revealed connections to similar operations at Catholic institutions in Indiana, Wisconsin, Iowa, and Minnesota, suggesting that dozens of additional victims might have suffered similar fates across the Midwest over the past decade. Federal marshals working with church officials identified buyers throughout 5 states who had purchased trafficked victims for use in coal mines, lumber operations, agricultural enterprises, and industrial facilities. The investigation revealed that the network had generated profits exceeding $100,000 during its years of operation, an astronomical sum for the 1850s that represented more wealth than most American communities would accumulate in a decade. The 3 criminals were transported to Springfield, Illinois, for trial, where they faced charges of murder, kidnapping, human trafficking, fraud, and conspiracy. The trial drew national attention as one of the first major prosecutions of organized human trafficking in American history. Newspapers throughout the country covered the proceedings, which revealed the shocking details of how religious institutions could be infiltrated and exploited by criminal organizations. The evidence presented during the trial was overwhelming and undeniable. Prosecutors presented the detailed records McKenna had kept of every transaction, correspondence with buyers throughout the Midwest, financial ledgers showing the profits from trafficking operations, and testimony from James O'Malley and other survivors who had witnessed the systematic disappearance of their classmates. Perhaps most damaging was the testimony of Samuel Morrison, the farmer whose property adjoined the seminary grounds. Morrison described finding personal belongings scattered along the fence line between his land and Sacred Heart, observing suspicious nighttime activity involving wagons and lanterns, and discovering disturbed earth in areas that later proved to be burial sites for murdered victims. The 3 criminals were convicted on all charges and sentenced to death by hanging, a punishment that was carried out on August 15, 1851, before a crowd of over 5,000 people. The executions drew spectators from across Illinois and neighboring states, including families of the victims, church officials, and anti-Catholic activists who saw the scandal as confirmation of their suspicions about Catholic institutions. The hanging of Seamus McKenna, Liam Doherty, and Fergus Lynch marked the end of one of the most extensive criminal conspiracies in American history, but the consequences of their actions continued to reverberate throughout Catholic communities for decades afterward. The scandal severely damaged Catholic credibility throughout the Midwest and provided ammunition for anti-Catholic movements that used the Sacred Heart case to argue that Catholic institutions posed inherent dangers to American society. Of the 10 students who had been sold as slaves rather than murdered, 6 were eventually located and freed through the extensive efforts of church officials and federal authorities working across multiple states. The rescued young men, bore both physical and psychological scars from their months or years of forced labor in mines, lumber camps, and industrial facilities where they had been treated as property rather than human beings. The recovery process for the survivors was long and difficult, requiring extensive medical treatment for injuries sustained during their captivity and psychological counseling to help them process the trauma of their experiences. Several of the rescued victims required months of rehabilitation before they could resume normal lives, and some never fully recovered from the physical and emotional damage inflicted during their enslavement. Tragically, 4 of the trafficked students were never found, despite extensive searches throughout mining and lumber operations across multiple states. These young men, Heinrich Weber from Milwaukee, Antoine Dubois from Detroit, Patrick Kelly from Chicago, and Sean O'Malley from Boston, vanished completely into the vast network of industrial operations that characterized America's westward expansion. Their families never learned their ultimate fate, carrying the burden of uncertainty and grief for the remainder of their lives. James O'Malley, whose courage and persistence had exposed the truth about Sacred Heart Seminary and saved the lives of future victims, was offered the opportunity to complete his priestly training at prestigious institutions throughout America and Europe. Church officials, grateful for his role in exposing the scandal, promised to support his education at any seminary he chose and to provide him with rapid advancement within the church hierarchy. However, James declined these offers and instead pursued a career in law enforcement, believing that his experience at Sacred Heart had revealed the need for better protection of vulnerable populations throughout American society. He became a federal marshal specializing in investigating human trafficking operations, using his knowledge of criminal techniques and his understanding of institutional vulnerabilities to prevent similar tragedies from occurring elsewhere. James's work as a federal marshal proved remarkably successful, leading to the identification and prosecution of dozens of trafficking operations throughout the Midwest and establishing investigative techniques that became standard practices for law enforcement agencies dealing with organized crime. His efforts resulted in the rescue of over 300 trafficking victims during his 30-year career, and the conviction of more than 200 criminals involved in various forms of human exploitation. The Catholic Church faced the enormous challenge of rebuilding trust and credibility in the aftermath of the Sacred Heart scandal, a process that required fundamental changes in how religious institutions were managed and monitored. Church officials implemented comprehensive verification procedures for priests assigned to American missions, requiring multiple forms of documentation and confirmation from Vatican authorities before any clergy could assume positions of authority. New communication systems were established between American and European church authorities, using telegraph networks and encrypted correspondence to ensure that the backgrounds and credentials of religious personnel could be verified quickly and accurately. Oversight mechanisms were created to monitor the activities of isolated institutions like seminaries and convents, requiring regular reports to diocesan authorities and unannounced inspections by independent church officials. Sacred Heart Seminary itself was permanently closed within weeks of the criminal's arrest, its buildings sealed and the property placed under church control while investigations continued. The magnificent Gothic revival structure that had cost $40,000 to construct was eventually demolished, and the land was sold to local farmers who wanted nothing to do with the property's horrific history. For decades afterward, locals reported Strange occurrences near the former seminary site that kept most people away from the area, especially after dark. Farmers working nearby fields claimed to hear unexplained sounds during the night. Voices calling out in distress, the sound of wagon wheels on roads that no longer existed, and church bells ringing from a tower that had been torn down years earlier. Whether these reports reflected genuine supernatural phenomena or simply the psychological impact of knowing about the horrors that had occurred on the site, they contributed to a persistent atmosphere of unease that affected the entire region. The former seminary grounds became known locally as cursed land that brought misfortune to anyone who attempted to work or live there. This horrifying chapter in American religious history reveals the dangerous vulnerability of immigrant communities and religious institutions during the chaotic period of westward expansion. When communication was slow, verification was difficult, and isolated communities could be exploited by criminals with sufficient cunning and ruthlessness. The Sacred Heart Seminary case stands as a stark reminder that evil can flourish anywhere when good people fail to ask difficult questions or challenge authority figures who demand blind obedience. The story also demonstrates the crucial importance of institutional oversight and transparency in preventing the abuse of vulnerable populations. The criminals' success depended entirely on their ability to operate in isolation, without external scrutiny or independent verification of their activities. Once Bishop Montini applied proper investigative techniques and Vatican resources to examine their claims, their deception was exposed within days. Perhaps most importantly, the Sacred Heart Seminary case shows how individual courage and persistence can triumph over institutional evil, even when the odds seem overwhelming. James O'Malley's decision to investigate suspicious circumstances and his determination to expose the truth despite personal danger saved the lives of future victims and brought justice for those who had already suffered. The techniques used by the criminals, exploiting religious authority, isolating victims from outside contact, creating plausible explanations for disappearances, and using financial incentives to maintain complicity, remain relevant today as warning signs of potential trafficking operations. The case provides a historical precedent for understanding how organized criminals can infiltrate and exploit trusted institutions for profit. What makes this story particularly chilling is its complete basis in historically plausible events and human psychology. Every aspect of the Sacred Heart Seminary operation, from the anti-Catholic sentiment that made oversight difficult to the economic incentives that made trafficking profitable, reflects genuine conditions in 1840s America. The criminals' techniques were sophisticated but entirely realistic, using methods that could be replicated by modern traffickers with access to similar opportunities and resources. This mystery shows us that sometimes the most terrifying monsters are not supernatural beings, but ordinary people who choose to commit extraordinary evil for profit and power. The horror at Sacred Heart Seminary emerged not from ghostly apparitions or demonic possession, but from human greed, violence, and the willingness to treat other people as commodities to be bought and sold. What do you think about this chilling tale of deception, trafficking, and murder hidden within a place meant to serve God? Does it make you wonder what other dark secrets might be buried beneath the official histories of religious institutions throughout America? Do you believe that proper oversight and investigation can prevent such horrors from happening again? Or are there aspects of human nature that make such evil inevitable when opportunity presents itself? Leave your thoughts in the comments below, and if you found this story as haunting and disturbing as we did, make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss our investigations into the darkest corners of American history. Share this video with anyone who appreciates true crime stories that reveal the complex realities behind simple explanations and the courage required to expose institutional evil. Until next time, remember that vigilance and the willingness to ask difficult questions remain our best defenses against those who would exploit trust and authority for their own dark purposes.